على محمد وآل محمد.
صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Inshallah, today we have a great program lined up for you, again with some beautiful Quran recitation, followed by a talk and an interactive short segment. So, without delaying it any further, inshallah, we'll have Brother Muhammad AlKhulaifi reading the Quran. Can we please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. عما يتساءلون عن النبأ العظيم الذي هم فيه مختلفون. كلا سيعلمون ثم كلا سيعلمون. ألم نجعل الأرض مهادا والجبال أوتادا وخلقناكم أزواجا وجعلنا نومكم سباتا وجعلنا الليل لباسا وجعلنا النهار معاشا وبنينا فوقكم سبعا شدادا وجعلنا سراجا وهاجا وأنزلنا من المعصرات ماء ثجاجا لنخرج به حبا ونباتا وجنات ألفافا. إن يوم الفصل كان ميقاتا يوم ينفخ في الصور فتأتون أفواجا وفتحت السماء فكانت أبوابا وسيرت الجبال فكانت سرابا. إن جهنم كانت مرصادا للطاغين مآبا لابثين فيها أحقابا لا يذوقون فيها بردا ولا شرابا إلا حميما وغساقا جزاء وفاقا. إنهم كانوا لا يرجون حسابا وكذبوا بآياتنا كذابا وكل شيء أحصيناه كتابا فذوقوا فلن نزيدكم إلا عذابا. إن للمتقين مفازا حدائق وأعنابا وكواعب أترابا وكأسا دهاقا لا يسمعون فيها لغوا ولا كذابا جزاء من ربك عطاء حسابا. رب السماوات والأرض وما بينهما الرحمن لا يملكون منه خطابا. يوم يقوم الروح والملائكة صفا لا يتكلمون إلا من أذن له الرحمن وقال صوابا. ذلك اليوم الحق فمن شاء اتخذ إلى ربه مآبا. إنا أنذرناكم عذابا قريبا يوم ينظر المرء ما قدمت يداه ويقول الكافر يا ليتني كنت ترابا. صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله الكريم. رحم الله مقرأ سورة الفاتحة تسبقها الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Thank you, Brother Muhammad, for that beautiful Quran recitation. Inshallah, we'll be continuing with our main segment, which will actually be touching on some of the themes of Surah An-Naba, of some of the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So inshallah, we will have our talk from Brother Jaafar AlKhulaifi. Can we please welcome him with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد
خير الخلق أجمعين محمد وآل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. Tonight, inshallah, our topic was chosen specifically because we are in a new era in the Western world, in the modern era, where we are fortunate enough to have many people who have endeavored in translating a lot of our primary hadith works. And the accessibility, or the increase in the accessibility of these hadith works for the English-speaking community is a blessing that is often overlooked in our times. So I decided to take a bit of your time, inshallah, tonight. It could be a bit of a longer presentation, inshallah, up to 40 minutes if I can have your patience, just to introduce some technical aspects of Shia hadith and how it came about, and appreciate the efforts that it took to compile these narrations, and how we can, as general lay people, benefit from these narrations. So just to start with an introduction that was prepared, that was from the work of a contemporary scholar, Sayyid Muhammad Sa'id al-Hakim, who's only passed away 2 or 3 years ago, one of the greatest scholars of our time in terms of knowledge and followers as well. He has a few points as to how we can actually benefit, or why do we benefit from connecting with our hadith works, especially the primary hadith works. He's got many points, but I just summarized them to 2 or 3. He says, I'm just going to read directly from his work. He says that connecting to the hadith corpus, or the collection or compilation of hadith works, it has an impact on the immunity from worldviews that arise, or that would conclude in the gradual deviance of Muslims. So Muslims could leave the truth without them realizing, because of the rise of new worldviews across different generations and eras. And so if you are acquainted with primary original hadith works and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt from the very primary source, you start to develop an immunity to those new worldviews that could affect your belief. And then he references a narration from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's a very profound narration if we can just reflect on that narration for a moment. The Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says that a person who takes his faith or takes his religion from the book of Allah and the sunnah of his Prophet, then mountains will tremble before he loses faith. But a person who takes his religion from the mouths of men can leave the religion, or can apostatize from the mouths of men as well. If you can reflect on that for a moment, it's not wrong to actually take religion from speakers or other people, but if your only, or the exclusive source of religion is in only the people's opinions, or what people say on the pulpit, or what your parents teach you, then your entire faith and your entire conviction in your religion is predicated on someone else's ability to persuade you and convince you, someone else's communication skills. And conversely, if someone who is on falsehood is able to persuade you otherwise, you could sway from the truth very easily. That's what's sort of hidden or trying to be said in this narration. Otherwise, if you actually take your religion from the primary sources, there's that raw element that these are, given that you do your due diligence understanding the sources of these hadiths, these are the actual teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam directly. And you know there's no element of bias in there. And finally, he mentions another point where he says, the one who lives the heritage, when you say heritage, we are referencing the original hadith compilations. When we engage with this constantly, it makes it seem like as if we are living with A'imma alayhim salam. We are living with Rasulullah. Because the way these narrations explain to us, it's not just what the Imam said or what the Prophet said. It describes their actions, it describes their emotions even. The moments that actually anger the Prophet, the moments that anger the Imam, the moments that sadden them. So you begin to taste a sense of culture of the Imams alayhim salam, and then you start to realize, even if you read the narration that's a bit different to everything else, you start to pick up on this, and you realize that this could be potentially a false narration, or maybe even said out of taqiyya. So that's the words of Sayyid al-Hakim rahmatullah alayh. So with this introduction from the late Sayyid, we inshallah start tonight's presentation. So what is a hadith exactly? So by default, this is just a default definition. The definition that is accepted by all Muslims, I'm trying to narrow down our understanding here, is that a hadith is the record of the words, actions or silent approval traditionally attributed to the Islamic Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So as a source of authority, the hadith is traditionally attributed to the Prophet is a source of religious law, moral guidance, as well as history. So we get our religious ahkam from there, as well as our guidance morally and history. And interchangeably, these words can be used: narration, tradition, hadith, report. And sometimes another word which is used is sunnah. Now, this isn't exactly a hadith. A sunnah is a bit of a greater level than a hadith. A sunnah is an established hadith. Because if you can look at the definition of hadith, it's something which is attributed to an infallible, to Rasulullah. But once the attribution is established, and that becomes synonymous with the Prophet or the synonymous with the Imam, then it becomes a sunnah, and a hadith is a means to try to reach the sunnah. So therefore we conclude the unequivocal main two primary sources of knowledge and inspiration for all Islamic fields of knowledge are the Quran and the Sunnah, without a doubt, and that's accepted by all Islamic faiths. Now, if we're going to look at some brief history to try to pinpoint what does the Shi'i school of thought specialize in, and what exclusivity does it have when it comes to approaching hadith. So firstly, just to try to be fair and highlight the differences, and then we'll try to substantiate these differences by looking at history. The Shi'is hold that the Sunnah of the 12 infallible Imams alayhim salam is pretty much synonymous or the legitimate Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. And the Sunnis look at the Sunnah of the Khulafa, especially the first 4 Khulafa, and the companions of the Prophet as a tariq, or a way to reach the Sunnah of the Prophet. Now this is where we're trying to explain why our approach makes us a bit special when it comes to hadith. We have to look at a brief history, inshallah. So a lot of this history is widely accepted. We don't have enough time to go through the evidences for this, so I'm just going to throw some historical facts. Hopefully maybe another time we can prove that. But after the Prophet's passing, there's a tragedy that is often overlooked that took place. And besides the Khilafah quarrel, and besides what happened, there's something that many people overlook. There was an official ban on the narration and the collection and dissemination of hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Not right after the death of the Prophet, but shortly after the first Khalifa came into power. And that ban was very strongly implemented by the first 2 Khalifs specifically. And the punishment for narrating the traditions of the Prophet were to the level of imprisonment. And the ban was only lifted around 100 years, so an entire century after the Prophet's era. So that was in the Khalifa's time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, who is Umayyad Khalif, that came towards the end of the Umayyad dynasty. And he actually lifted this hadith ban. So what we're looking at here is an entire century where the community felt a void of connection towards the teachings of the Prophet after the life of the Prophet. So during the life of the Prophet, it was widely accepted that you have to implement the lifestyle of the Prophet into your own life. His teachings have to be disseminated as much as possible. But why is it that after his passing, that stopped for an entire century? So that puts a question mark. So what is the Shi'i solution? Because that was the general line of Muslims who say the majority sect had that problem. The Shi'is had that problem as well, but did the Shi'i sort of school of thought, did the adherents and the followers of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam have a solution to counteract this very detrimental problem? The first solution, which is not mentioned here, but I just remembered, there was the first hadith compilation that was actually compiled was from the Shi'i side, which is Kitab Sulaym, that was compiled towards the end of the life of the Prophet and continued compilation after the life of the Prophet. But another way to counteract is oral transmission, which in little bits and pieces did take place across the Muslim nation even throughout the prohibition, because oral transmission, as long as you're not caught by the wrong person, can still be relied upon somehow. But the greatest counteraction or the greatest solution that we had as Shia Muwalin to Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam was the knowledge of Imam Ali alayhi salam and the Imams from his progeny of the Sunnah or of the prophetic teachings. We're going to demonstrate that here. Firstly, we're going to remind ourselves of some history, just to look at this diagram of the timeline. So the first two Khulafa, there was very little transmission of ahadith. This is the post-prophetic Islamic era. And then in the time of the third Khalif and up until the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam, there began to become some dissemination due to the different political situations. There was less pressure on people. It wasn't as enforced, the ban. But then, because we had several decades where no one was attributing much things to the Prophet, when the Umayyads came into power, especially Muawiyah and the likes of Muawiyah, and the agendas that they sought to implement, the envy that they had towards Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, this was the perfect opportunity to unfortunately mass fabricate many narrations. And this resulted in a skewed perception of history, and this is why we have people today that certain personalities, we think very highly of them, and then another school of thought thinks very low of them, and vice versa. Because many people sought to elevate statuses of other individuals, they are meant to validate their position in power and lower the status of others. And that was probably the most detrimental period in terms of academic Islamic heritage. And then for the general line of Muslims, again, that only stopped in the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz's rule, where he stopped the ban of hadith. 100 years later, people actually started learning. Again, this is the general Muslim line. But why do we have speciality as Shia, as Mu'alin of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam? Going back to the solution that we had, is the knowledge of Imam Ali alayhi salam of the Sunnah, of the lifestyle of the Prophet. It is undoubtedly accepted by everyone who does some research that the companion that had the most knowledge, the person at the time of the Prophet that had the most knowledge from the Prophet was Imam Ali alayhi salam. And I can assure you that that is the belief of scholars from all schools of thought. Okay, some people place others higher in terms of rank, unfortunately, but they still testify to his knowledge being superior to everyone else. And there are too many narrations to even go through to prove this, but I just picked one which actually demonstrates the extent to which Imam Ali had knowledge from the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So AlKhulaifi narrates from Al-Kafi that the Imam Ali alayhi salam says that he had regular meetings twice a day with the Prophet. So one at day, one during the day and one during the night. And all the companions knew of these meetings, yet no one was allowed but him in those meetings. And Imam Ali explains that there was no ayah revealed in the Quran, but that the Prophet explained to me everything about it. And that when I had finished asking questions, the Prophet would start from his end. So the Prophet would initiate the conversation so as to increase the knowledge of Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam. At the end of the narration, Imam Ali says that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he makes a dua to Allah such that Imam Ali forgets not a single letter from what he just taught him. So this shows the extent that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi transmits everything that he learns directly from Allah through Jibreel to Imam Ali alayhi salam. And then other narrations come and explain that the outcome of these meetings was the compilation of something called Al-Jami'ah, which is literally means the comprehensive. And that is a book dictated by Rasulullah, written by Imam Ali, which was passed on from Imam to Imam. And that is why we have a very special aspect to our hadith collection. Firstly, it has been written down, and we as Shia, because we have infallible Imams that were passing on this knowledge that was taken directly from the Prophet, we have a line of immunity to the unfortunate tragedy of hadith prohibition and hadith fabrication. So even though that has affected the entire Muslim corpus, but the Shia have a line of immunity because of the fact that Imam Ali was endowed with the knowledge from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this was passed on to every Imam undoubtedly. Now, this is the importance of written transcription. And if you think about it as well, the fact that this is going to be preserved and disseminated for generations, the fact that it's written down allows the text itself be less susceptible to change. Other schools of thought, because of the fact that there was a century of prohibition, they had to strongly rely on oral transmission. And as we know with oral transmission, think Chinese whispers, things could change over time. And so, skipping a bit of history, skipping the time of Imam al-Hasan, Imam al-Hussein, Imam Sajjad, alayhim salatu wassalam, due to the political circumstances, as much as they taught their companions, the biggest influx of Shi'i hadith teachings and the true ahkam of Rasulullah. And when we say the Jami'ah, that book that the Imams had, actually was spread out to the people, and people started learning the true ahkam of Islam, was during the times of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. That was primarily due to the fact that the Umayyads had a decline, so the Umayyad dynasty, the power had declined, and the Abbasids are coming into power, but they're still in their infancy period. So that relative power tug of war, political tug of war, caused a bit of relative freedom for Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq to institutionalize the hadith teachings in a very direct manner. So Imam Sadiq at its peak, we say, the report tells us he had up to 4,000 students hearing directly from him and writing down. So he is telling them what he was taught by Rasulullah. Now, this resulted in something that was later became known as al-Usul al-Arba'mi'ah, which means the 400 principles. And this is the very foundation of the Shi'i hadith works. What is the 400 principles? Simply, if you want to look at the definition on the board, I'm not going to read all of that, I'll just try to explain it quickly. The 400 principles are 400 disciples of the Imam alayhim salam, the students of the Prophet, of the Imams, during their time, that heard directly from the Imams, that wrote down what they taught them. That they wrote down the Islamic hadith, the ahkam, the spiritual guidance, the historical events, the theological matters, the social matters, everything that they learned from the Imam was written down in some sort of booklet. And each companion had their own asl. And asl is just writing down the contents of what the Imam told you directly, or if it is through someone else who wrote down from the Imam. So by definition, it is allowed that there is one person between you and the Imam, given that that person is very reliable, like the likes of Zurara and Abu Basir and Muhammad bin Muslim, who are amongst the fuqaha of Ahlul Bayt and one of the greatest students of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. So this diagram explains to you, in the first section here, the students learn from Jaafar al-Sadiq, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and they create their own booklets, their own usul, and then the likes of Zurara explains it to other people who create their own usul. Ultimately, when the scholars came together, they found 400 usul. Unfortunately, today only 16 of those remain extant, so 16. So we actually have access to the manuscripts, the original version of 16 of those. However, the rest were compiled into books that we will discuss in a moment. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So I hope that wasn't too much historically, but we're just trying to substantiate a very important Shi'i position. We mentioned at the start of the presentation that the primary source for hadith, for Islamic knowledge entirely, is Quran and Sunnah. There's no dispute from that, from the Shi'i side at all. However, there is one very famous mutawatir narration, and everyone knows this narration, everyone has heard it sometime in their life. It's on the board, if we can read it, if we to ourselves. إِنِّي تَارِكُمْ فِيكُمُ الثَّقَلَيْنِ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ وَعِتْرَةِ أَهْلَ بَيْتِي. The famous mutawatir narration. Now, we just want to explain what mutawatir means in a moment. Mutawatir is a level of authenticity that is higher than anything else. Essentially, if something is mutawatir, it has been narrated by so many different chains of individuals across so many different generations that it becomes impossible for that narration to be fabricated. So many different people from so many different generations came and said that a certain thing happened. So it becomes impossible for those people all to conspire to fabricate this attribution. And this is like the Quran. The Quran itself is, technically speaking, a hadith. It was compiled at the time of the Prophet, and it was learnt and memorized and written down and disseminated across generations, and has reached us today, and we have a definite degree, a certain degree of knowledge that this is from the Prophet. Why? Because it reached us through tawatur. It reached us through such a level, so many people told us, and so many different generations, that there is no way that this is fabricated. Hadith al-Thaqalain is on that level of authenticity. So it essentially holds the same regard as the Quran in terms of hujjiyah, in terms of binding proof on us as Muslims. And the hadith simply says that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, towards the end of his life, he left the people with two things to hold on to, and that is the Quran and his progeny, the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wassalam. And that's what we come and say as Shia. Although Quran and Sunnah are our primary methods of sources of Islamic knowledge, the way to reach the Sunnah is through the Ahlul Bayt alayhim afdalus salatu wassalam, and that is through the testimony of this hadith and through the testimony of the history that we just explained earlier, and the fact that we had a line of immunity through the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. So if we want to come and say what are the two-way things? Who are the Ahlul Bayt? Because the Prophet says, وَعِتْرَتِي أَهْلَ بَيْتِ. There is some dispute amongst the Muslims, and some Muslims come and argue that the Ahlul Bayt are other individuals, could be the Prophet's wives, could be the Prophet's uncles, and everyone that's related to the Prophet is Ahlul Bayt somehow. But we have in our own books, as well as the books of the Sunnah, proof that the Ahlul Bayt is actually confined to certain individuals. If we want to look at this narration, the Prophet ﷺ says, I am appointing as successors amongst you two weighty things, the Book of Allah and my Ahlul Bayt. Indeed, these two things will never be separated until they approach me at the basin, like these two. So the narration says he joined between his two index fingers, so as to indicate the inseparability of the Quran and Ahlul Bayt. And then Jabir bin Abdullah Ansari, one of the major companions, he asked him, who are the Ahlul Bayt or the Prophet? He said, Ali, Hassan, Hussein, and the Imams from the son of Hussein until the day of resurrection. Now, we want to take a look at two things here. The content of this hadith is very inspirational. It validates our belief as Imamis, as Shia, as those who refer to the teachings of those individuals. However, we're trying to discuss hadith in general here. So who was to say that the Prophet actually said this thing? I'm sitting here in the 21st century in Australia, and the Prophet is from 7th century Arabia, and I'm attributing this to the Prophet somehow, and all of you are expected to believe that the Prophet said this. Can we trace this historically? This is why this is actually not the entire hadith. When we refer to our primary hadith works, when we try to pick this up in an original book where it's found, we find something much more extensive. So if you look at the Arabic version here, it's 3.5 lines. The actual Arabic is around 5-6 lines, which I cut up from. The English is around, which what I placed here is around 4 lines or so. The actual English is around 10 lines or so. So what has been omitted? What did I omit to actually get to the gist of the narration? So this is what the narration entirely looks. So if you want to look at both sets of text put together, this is how a narration is found, albeit in Arabic, in the primary source. And we want to focus on the structure here to understand what it is that allows us to trace this narration to its original source and understand its attribution to the Prophet ﷺ. It's got a chain, which is a top part, two main components. There's an isnad, which is a chain, and there's a matan, which is content. The isnad is at the top. The isnad is a chain. A chain means that it is a list of the individuals who transmitted this attribution across generations up until the person who compiled it all and put it in a book. And that is, in this case, Shaykh al-Saduq. So the entire blue, light blue version at the top is this chain. And then within the chain you have certain components, such as the muhaddith is the person who compiled the narration. The shaykh or the teacher of that person is the person who first taught him this narration. And then the main narrator is the rawi, and he's the person who precedes the infallible, or precedes the person who said the narration. And in this case, coincidentally, the main narrator is Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, who is infallible himself. But the main infallible is Rasulullah, who says the narration, if that makes sense. So we have a chain saying that I heard from this person who wrote in this book, or like who I read from this book, from this person's book, etc., going back to the Prophet ﷺ, and then the chain, the content of the narration. And then down the bottom is the masdar, or the source, and it's called Ma'ani al-Akhbar. The moment you know, once you become familiar with the hadith books, you know this is Shaykh al-Saduq's book, so then you have an entire historical trace to the Prophet, and then you can understand and even examine the attribution. So, why all this complexity? Why are we bothering ourselves with trying to establish the authenticity? And many hadiths are fabricated, many hadiths are authentic. How do we know what to follow, what not to follow? Why not just stick to the greatest book on earth, the Quran? Right? It sounds like an amazing solution. Why not? We all know the Quran, as we said earlier, it's mutawatir, so it's the highest level of authenticity. We know the Quran's never been changed. We know that the Quran contains wisdom and scientific predictions, so many different things that we can go on and on about. Why not just mainly obtain our scientific knowledge from the Quran? Obviously this can be refuted for many points, but we can summarize it or boil it down to 3 main points, inshaAllah. Firstly, the Quran itself, even if you try to stick to the Quran and only follow the Quran, you're going to face a problem, because the Quran itself provides an extended source of authority in Islam. And that is the Prophet ﷺ and his Ahlul Bayt. In many countless verses, the Quran repeatedly commands us to follow the Prophet. Look at the Prophet's teachings, look at the Prophet's teachings. We don't want to mention those verses for the sake of time, but I put some references there in the brackets. just 4 of like dozens of verses that explicitly tell you to go to the Prophet, and many of those verses also extend it to Ulil Amr or the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. So that's the first argument. The Quran, even if you try to follow it, it's going to tell you to go elsewhere. It's going to tell you this is not enough, go to the Hadith, go to Rasulullah and his Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. And then the second evidence is what we discussed earlier, Hadith al-Thaqalain, which is mutawatir. In its authenticity, it's at the same level of the Quran, so it can't be rejected. The Prophet is telling us Quran and Ahlul Bayt, and the narration says that he put his 2 index fingers together. So he's not saying just hold on to the Quran, neither is he saying hold on to the Ahlul Bayt only. He mentions Quran and Ahlul Bayt as your means of salvation. So it becomes actually problematic if you only hold on to one of them. Essentially, if you want to boil it down in a nutshell, the Quran is used as a standard to compare the hadiths of Ahlul Bayt, to understand which hadith is true, and the Ahlul Bayt's hadith are used to actually explain the Quran as well, interpret the Quran. So they are complementing each other. And finally, final point, so as to why we don't stick to the Quran, is the reality of our ahkam. You know, we get up to pray 5 times a day, and we have a certain number of rak'at for each prayer. None of these details are found in the Quran. The Quran tells us to pray. It doesn't tell us how to pray. It tells us to, get married legitimately. It doesn't actually provide us with the method. The sigha is nowhere in the Quran. The legitimacy of our parents' marriage and consequently our births is something predicated on authentic hadith, not the Quran. So the Quran says, zina is haram and marriage is amazing. It doesn't tell us how to get married. So it's all actually found in a hadith. So there is no way that you can only stick to the Quran. There's absolutely no way. So if you can recall, we discussed the usul, trying to get through as much content with the minimal time that we have. So we discussed the usul earlier, the 400 principles, which we said are the booklets compiled by the students of the Imams alayhim salam. Those were canonized or gathered into what is known as the 4 books, Al-Kutub al-Arba'a. Those are primarily the 4 main Shi'i hadith original works. That is Kitab al-Kafi by Shaykh al-Khulaifi, Al-Istibsar by Shaykh al-Saduq, Man la yahdaruhu al-Faqih by Shaykh al-Tusi, and Tahdhib al-Ahkam by Shaykh al-Tusi as well. Sorry, Man la yahdaruhu al-Faqih is by Shaykh al-Saduq, and Tahdhib al-Ahkam is by Shaykh al-Tusi. So, we just want to briefly go over these, just to save time. Those are the 4 main books. However, I would like to challenge something. It is usually said that those are the 4 main books, but I don't like this mustalah without specification. Those are the 4 main fiqh books, not the 4 main books only, because there are many other amazing primary sources. If we say those are the 4 main books, it's so as to discredit the validity or the usefulness of other books. But those are the main fiqh books, meaning that when you refer to your marji', when you go to check out what's halal and what's haram, they derive majority of their rulings from these hadiths. Obviously they refer to the Quran and other things, but the hadith is ultimately the most abundantly available resource, so it's mostly what is used to derive what is halal and what is haram. Those are the books which are relied on the most, and those primarily constitute of the 400 usul that we discussed earlier. Now, I want to talk about other books. Specifically, we want to put Al-Kafi as our main thing right now, our main book, and then the 3 other books are primarily purely fiqh. So there aren't really books for us as lay people, as general people, as people who haven't really went to study Hawza or going into that field to really look into, because it could actually confuse us. If we want to understand fiqh, we go towards our Risala Amaliyah of the scholar that we follow. We go to the marji' and we understand what's halal and haram. So that's called Al-Istibsar, Tahdhib al-Ahkam, and Man la yahdaruhu al-Faqih. However, Al-Kafi is a very special case. As much as it's got a lot of fiqh, it's got a lot of other topics which we'll discuss in a moment. Just one final point on this topic. If you look at the brackets next to the names of the scholars, we have the year of their death, and that's a very specific point. This is why we refer to these scholars as classical scholars, and this is why we refer to their works as primary hadith compilation, because the actual dates of their death, the years of their death, Al-Khulaifi died in 329 AH. Some people say 328, but regardless, the year that the minor occultation, meaning the first era of ghaiba of our 12th Imam, actually ended on that same year that Al-Khulaifi died, which means that Al-Khulaifi lived in the early years of the 12th Imam. And there's even an opinion that he was born in the time of Imam al-Askari, the 11th Imam. which means that he's coming and he's providing a chain to narrations from the Imams preceding them, mostly from Imam Sadiq and Imam al-Baqir, and those are only 2 or 3 generations prior. So there's not much of a time distance between the Khulaini and the Imams alayhim salam. It's not like me attributing something to the Prophet and getting a chain from here to the 7th century. It actually increases in veracity and credibility of these scholars because they're actually very close in time to the time of the Imams alayhim salam. And then the other scholars are also in near proximity. Shaykh al-Saduq only 50 years later, and Shaykh al-Tusi around a century later. Kitab al-Kafi for a moment. As we said, it's a very special book, and it is regarded as the most reliable Shia hadith book, widely regarded. It's compiled by Muhammad bin Yaqub bin Ishaq al-Khulaini, who was born in Tehran, modern day Tehran. He was known as Al-Ray back then. And the reason for his compilation was someone came to him. We don't know who that person is. We just know that someone came to him and he told him that we are in the time where there's no longer an Imam. I want to perform my ahkam. I don't know what to do. Different narrations are telling me different things. I'm not understanding this. Please help me. So Khulaini, in response, he compiled what he thought to be reliable across all religious fields. As whatever religious topic you can think of, there's something in about it in Al-Kafi. So this is why Al-Kafi is very special. And this is why it was actually named Al-Kafi, which means the sufficient. So Khulaini thought that if you refer to this book, as well as the Quran, it's sufficient for you. So I'm going to skip this because I mentioned some things about him earlier. Just a quick comment. And Najashi, who is an expert in understanding the biography of the classical personalities, he talks about him. He says that he compiled Al-Kafi within 20 years and that he is the shaykh or the teacher of our companions. There's a lot of praise for him, the preeminent one for Al-Khulaini. So if you want to look at the structure of Al-Kafi, there's 8 volumes. 2 are Usul Al-Kafi, 5 are Furu' Al-Kafi, and there's 1 Rawda. As lay people, again, we skip the fiqh section. We refer to Al-Marji'. So for volumes 3, 4, 5, 6, and 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, we don't really read those books because they talk about fiqh. It's going to be boring. We don't really understand how to derive the halal and haram. That's reality. We go to the scholars. However, when it comes to our aqa'id, we build our own aqa'id. We don't build our own fiqh. When it comes to our spiritual connection with Allah, we want to build that ourselves. When we want to understand history and where the reports come from, we want to understand that ourselves. We don't want to just blindly follow a scholar. So these things all are within Al-Kafi. If you look at volume 1, so each volume has a few books. There's a book of intellect and ignorance. There's a book of knowledge and its virtues. There's a book on the oneness of God, and a book of the vicegerent of God, so the Imams and the Prophets. So this is all within volume 1, and that has all been translated into English. And the print that is shown on the slide here, in my opinion, that's the best translation possible by Sheikh Ridwan Aratsu, and it's got a commentary as well. So if you wanted to keep note of that, that is the best possible translation of Al-Kafi. And volume 2, which we also should pay heed to, it's probably the most useful volume practically. It's got a lot of social ethics, things about Iman and Kufr and how to live your life like a mu'min, things about dua, what you should supplicate, what dua you should make at which time of your life or which requirement that you want from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a book about the virtues of the Quran, and a book about companionship and friendship. So which people you should actually be friends with. Now, we want to talk about something most people are probably it's going to be going through their mind, and that is authenticity. We touched on it a bit earlier, but if we're going to give a brief rundown, as much as technical as things could be, we want to explain what we mean when we say a hadith is authentic. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. So oftentimes you hear things, oh, this is an amazing narration, but it's not authentic, it's weak, things like that. So what does that actually mean? So for something to be authentic, primarily when people say this hadith is sahih or this hadith is authentic, they are referring to the chain. Remember how we said there's an isnad and there's a matan, there's a chain and there's content. The chain itself, it's got names of individuals across history who transmitted this narration. There's the criteria for something to be authentic. If you just pay attention to the very high threshold criteria, all the narrators in the chain have to be known historically, so their identity has to be known. They have to be believers, so they have to be Imami Ithna Ashari, and they have to be reliable. So they have to be known, they have to be believers, and they have to be reliable. The moment that all the narrators in the chain that hadith contains are known, are believed, and are reliable, then this hadith is labelled as authentic in modern terms, because this term has changed over time. This is to tell us that if something is not authentic, it does not mean that it's fabricated. That is one of the biggest takeaways from this entire presentation. If someone says this hadith is weak, it does not mean that this hadith has not been said by the Imam. In fact, there's a still very plausible chance that this hadith has been issued, especially if the actual content of the narration is not problematic. It doesn't go against the established principles of the Quran and the Sunnah. Whereas if something is authentic, it just generally means that all the people that told us about this narration are top individuals, theologically, socially, whatever it may be. But if it's weak, it doesn't mean that it's fabricated. And I'll explain this a bit more in a bit. The actual science that is studied in the Hawza and the scholars that exert a lot of effort to understand the names of the individuals is ilm rijal. It's pretty much referring to the biographies and the commentary of scholars on the personalities within those chains and the people that lived around the time of the Imams alayhim salam across different generations. Ilm al-diraya is also understand to comprehend a hadith. And then you have other studies talking about the authenticity of content. So if you overlook the chain for a moment and you actually look at what the hadith is saying, it's very crucial to do that as scholars and as lay people as well. The gold standard, if you like, that is usually postulated by the Shia is that as long as it does not contradict the Quran and the established Sunnah, then this hadith is not to be rejected immediately. As long as it does not, and that's when we say rejected, we say by scholars rejected because they have to study the entire criteria, not just anyone rejects at face value. So as long as it does not contradict the Quran and established Sunnah, there is no need to reject it. You have to study it further, potentially take it on board. And the case study for this is a very interesting one, if we have time to go through. There's a hadith which says that the Prophet ﷺ actually encourages us to insult and do sab of people of innovation. This hadith is found in AlKhulaifi, and it is authentic by chain, meaning that the individuals in there are known, are believers, and are reliable. Yet someone like Sayyid Sistani comes and he rejects this narration. This is why, because he analysed the content, and in his opinion, this is against the ruh of the Quran, the spirit of the Quran. The Quran is very, very much against those who insult. In the Quran it says, do not insult those who insult Allah. In the Quran it says that. So Sayyid Sistani believes this is against the life of the Prophet and the ruh of the Quran, so it must have been fabricated or potentially misinterpreted somehow, even though the chain is authentic. And that's a very rare situation where you have an authentic chain with a problematic content, but it still exists, and it shows that the scholars are doing the due diligence to actually lay down the criteria. So other indicators of reliability of hadith is history. So understanding historical context and reports. For example, again, there's a narration in Al-Kafi which says that Yazid ibn Muawiyah, after killing Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he went to Hajj and he wanted to perform Hajj. Alam al-Majlisi comes and he says, what's going on here? This can't be true. History doesn't say that any of Yazid's people went to Hajj. In fact, they attacked Hajj. They attacked Mecca afterwards. And they killed his people. And he doesn't reject the narration, but he says potentially it's talking about another Yazid. So there is that scholarly effort to understand the context. And other indicators are geography and corroboration, we'll discuss in a moment, inshallah. So what is weakness? I want to go through this very quickly. If something is weak, does not mean it's fabricated. It simply means that the chain has a person who is either unknown historically, we don't know who that person is. It's disconnected, which means that between two people in the chain, there is a considerable period of there's a generation or two, which makes it very unplausible that one person heard it from the other. It's like me saying that I heard from someone who lived 200 years ago. Makes no sense. Or someone is just generally unreliable. And someone could be unreliable for a number of reasons. They could be known to be very forgetful, especially those who are at senior age during the time of the Imams alayhim salam. Or some could be known to be liars. So people maliciously lied upon the Imams alayhim salam. Or some could be condemned from the Imam for a reason or two. The Imams specifically condemned those individuals. Or they have deviant beliefs. So even if they have deviant beliefs, it drops down from authenticity, even if they could be generally reliable people. And then again, weak does not mean fabricated, because think about it for a moment. A lying person doesn't always lie. Sometimes there are truthful hadith, because a weak person narrated it, he could have said that truth in that moment. However, the moment that there is a chance that something is fabricated is when there is a hadith with no chain whatsoever. That is the problem sometimes. We oftentimes hear narrations, or the Prophet said this, the Imam said this. We unfortunately sometimes even hear it from the pulpit, but even the speaker himself, he's got no trace of that narration from historical works. He just heard it from someone else who's heard it from someone else. And that's why it's problematic, and that's why it's important to actually engage with the primary sources, because you're able to validate whatever a scholar tells you, a speaker tells you. You became familiar with the text of the Imams. So when something has no chain, it is just like me here attributing something to the Prophet without actual historical trace of it. It becomes very problematic in that sense. Let's skip this one. Now, there is a claim that is made usually against Shi'is, and sometimes within Shi'i circles. We say AlKhulaifi, which we talked about earlier, is our most reliable book. However, there is a statistical study by Shahid Thani, one of our late grand scholars, rahmatullah alayh, and he breaks down the chains of AlKhulaifi. He finds that there are 5,000 sahih, authentic narrations, and up to 9,000 weak narrations. Now that's our most reliable book, supposedly. Why is our greatest book? 2/3 of it are weak, statistically. Now it's a problem that we have to understand. Now it's actually something that, if you understand it with context, it's only a testament to the great effort of Khulaini in compiling AlKhulaifi. The messages and content of AlKhulaifi have a unique self-corroborating property. What do I mean by that? If one was to remove all the weak narrations, so-called, in AlKhulaifi, you actually still come out with a strong understanding of the tenets of Tashayyu', of Shia Islam. Why? Is because every narration, every chapter in AlKhulaifi is anchored around an authentic narration from which the rest of the hadith can be corroborated. Or they have an authentic narration in another book. So Al-Khulaini, when it comes to compile AlKhulaifi, he only titles the chapters based on principles that have an authentic narration proving them, if that makes sense. And even though they could have 3 or 4 more weak narrations, as long as you have an authentic evidence for that chapter, then the chapter stands. To just elaborate on this further, there's a case study. There's a chapter in AlKhulaifi which talks about the things that reach a deceased person after their death. So it talks about Alamul Barzakh and what, like Al-Fatiha, when you recite it for a deceased person, how does it manifest in the next world? There's 6 narrations in this entire chapter. All of them say the same thing, but only 2 of them are authentic by chain. But the scholars come and they authenticate the remainder of them, because as long as the content is substantiated by a number of authentic narrations, then the content becomes accepted. So this is part of the unique ability of Khulaini to compile reliable content-wise, because the strictness that came towards the chain actually came out in later generations and later scholars. So just to conclude, inshallah, what other books should I read? We should definitely pay attention to the works of Sheikh Saduq, who is someone who came a few decades after Khulaini, and he is probably the greatest muhaddith, the greatest compiler of narration. Obviously, it's debatable, but he was able to categorize narrations in such a niche manner. So he would pick up compilations on very specific topics. For example, the books that you have on the board, we have Ma'ani al-Akhbar, which literally means the meaning of reports, which literally he's trying to compile hadiths which explain other hadiths. So an entire large book which only contains hadiths which explain other hadiths or explain verses in the Quran. It's a very specific ability of Shaykh al-Saduq to pick out hadith. Another book is called Al-Khisal. Al-Khisal means the characteristics or the qualities of someone. So this entire book just picks up on hadiths that talk about the qualities of a believer, qualities of a patient person, of a disbeliever, things like that. So it's very good for us to read it, to put ourselves in check, to realize what category of an individual do I fall under, do I possess these characteristics. And finally, there's many more books, but Kitab al-Tawheed I would recommend for everyone to dive into that book, because it's truly amazing. It talks about the ma'rifah of Allah. And interestingly, Muhammad's presentation a few weeks ago, when he was talking about the ma'rifah of Allah, most narrations were from Kitab al-Tawheed of Shaykh al-Saduq. And very profound narrations. The way these narrations speak about Allah, it's not found in any other hadith compilation of any other school of thought. And where can I read these? Alhamdulillah, most of the primary hadith narrations have been translated into English. Not all of them. Some of them are still in the works. And fortunately, most of them are available online for free. If you head to thaqalain.net, you find our primary hadith sources which have been translated in English, and you can start reading from there. Finally, I know we've passed the time. I just want to comment on one more book, which when we think Shia Hadith, we usually reference or think of that book, and that is Bihar al-Anwar. What about Bihar al-Anwar? We didn't mention that before, did we? So we have to give some context on Bihar al-Anwar. Some people unfortunately try to discredit that book, and some people try to use it as the primary source and the final, like the most important book, which is neither are true. Pretty much this is a secondary source, it's not a primary source, meaning it was compiled in the latter centuries, not the earlier centuries. Secondly, it was pretty much a comprehensive attempt to preserve the heritage of the Imams, rather than a selective attempt to compile. What does that mean? It means that Alam al-Majlisi, the compiler of the book, he was in a position where he had access to many resources, Islamic resources, because of the political climate at the time. And he realized that so many books could actually be lost over time. So I want to do something about it. So he decided to archive everything he could possibly get his hands upon, and he created an encyclopedia. And that resulted in 110 volumes. Now, as much as that is beneficial, as much as that's helped a lot of scholars, when we read this book, and we read some narrations of this book, we have to realize that this is not a primary hadith work, and the fact that it was a comprehensive compilation means there's a higher chance, there's a higher probability of weak hadith and fabricated hadith potentially, but that doesn't discredit the work of Alam al-Majlisi, because his purpose was not to selectively identify the hadith, rather to preserve all the hadith. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi tayyibin at-tahirin.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
A few minutes over, I don't know if there's time for questions, or do we just...
I think it's just we're just gonna finish it.
See?
Yeah.
Can we please have another loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad? Thank you, Brother Jaafar, Ahsan, for the amazing talk. Inshallah, we'll be able to have a stronger understanding of the fundamentals of our faith, of the hadith, of the sunnah, of the authentic sources, and also of the unauthenticated sources, which we may still be able to use with the right research. And inshallah, we'll be able to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and through the Ahlul Bayt, which has been entrusted to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we will be moving on to our interactive segment, which will be led by our brother Muhammad Razlan. Can we please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
All right, who's ready? Who's ready for